History tells us that after World War II, justice was done. Evil was exposed, criminals were judged, the world moved on. But that story is incomplete. Because while the world watched Nuremberg, dozens of other courtrooms operated in silence. Run by the United States. Hidden behind barbed wire. With verdicts delivered quickly and forgotten just as fast. Some trials were never publicized. Some sentences were later questioned, even by American judges. And some cases raised a dangerous question. What happens when the victors of a war control justice without ever putting themselves on trial? When the fighting stopped in Europe in May 1945, there was no celebration inside the ruins. Cities like Berlin, Hamburg, Cologne, and Munich were fields of rubble. Railways lay twisted. Entire neighborhoods had been reduced to foundations and ash. The smell of smoke, decay, and unburied bodies lingered for weeks. American soldiers moved through landscapes that no longer resembled countries. They resembled evidence. Mass graves were discovered by accident. Camps were entered with no warning. Guards had fled. Prisoners were too weak to stand. Some were already dead, stacked like cordwood. For the U.S. Army, victory created an immediate moral crisis. What should be done with the men responsible? Not politically, not symbolically, but legally. The United States had never before occupied a defeated enemy on this scale. It had never governed millions of civilians while simultaneously uncovering crimes of such magnitude. There was no single plan. What followed was improvisation, sometimes principled, sometimes rushed, sometimes deeply flawed. Back home, American newspapers published photographs from liberated camps. The images were shocking even to a population hardened by years of war reporting. The public demanded accountability. President Harry S. Truman supported international cooperation, but also believed strongly in American legal authority. The U.S. Army shared that belief and moved quickly to establish its own judicial mechanisms. This decision would shape everything that followed. Justice would not be centralized. It would be fragmented. By mid-1945, two parallel systems emerged. Nuremberg, Germany. Tokyo, Japan. Highly publicized. Carefully staged. Designed to set global legal precedents. Operated by U.S. Army authority. Hundreds of trials. Little press access. Often held inside former enemy facilities. Faster, quieter, less transparent. The second system handled far more defendants, yet received a fraction of the attention. These courts were not civilian courts. They were not international courts. They were wartime instruments operating after the war had ended. That contradiction would cause serious problems. The legal basis for American war crimes trials rested on the laws of war, military necessity, executive authority. But the rules were often vague. Defendants were tried by military officers, not civilian judges. Denied jury trials. Sometimes convicted on circumstantial evidence. Often sentenced quickly. Appeals were limited. Review boards were internal. To many commanders, speed mattered more than perfection. Evidence was everywhere, but documentation was often incomplete. Witnesses were traumatized. Language barriers complicated testimony. Justice had to move fast, or risk disappearing entirely. The U.S. Army relied heavily on military commissions, a legal structure previously used in the Civil War, colonial conflicts, occupied territories. These commissions allowed flexibility, but sacrificed safeguards. Rules of evidence were relaxed. Hearsay was sometimes permitted. Confessions carried enormous weight. This system favored prosecutors. And prosecutors knew it. Early trials focused on camp guards, SS personnel, low to mid-level officers, medical staff involved in experimentation. High-ranking figures were often reserved for international tribunals or quietly bypassed if politically useful later. This selective focus shaped historical memory. The public would see symbolic justice, not systemic justice. In the summer of 1945, trials moved at a pace rarely seen in legal history. Some defendants were arrested, charged, tried, and sentenced within weeks. Executions followed quickly. This urgency was driven by fear of evidence loss, political pressure, the belief that delay meant denial. But speed had consequences. Mistakes were inevitable. Military judges were not villains. They were officers, many with legal training, some without. They were asked to judge crimes unlike anything in American legal precedent. They worked long hours. They faced overwhelming caseloads. They operated under command structures. Independence was limited, and some judges privately expressed discomfort with the process. Interrogation methods became the most controversial aspect of American-run trials. Investigators worked under pressure. They believed guilt was obvious. They wanted confirmation, not discovery. Some interrogations crossed ethical lines. Later internal reviews would acknowledge this, but only quietly. At the time, convictions mattered more than process. By late 1946, concerns emerged inside the U.S. Army itself. Not about whether crimes had occurred, but about whether justice was being applied correctly. Review boards began examining transcripts. Some sentences were reduced, others upheld. The system adjusted, but never publicly acknowledged its flaws. Unlike Nuremberg, these trials had no dramatic courtroom scenes, no iconic defendants, no unified narrative. They were bureaucratic, technical, and uncomfortable. They did not fit a heroic story, so they were forgotten. By the end of 1946, hundreds had been convicted, dozens executed, thousands imprisoned. Justice had been served, but not evenly, transparently, or consistently. And the most controversial trials were still ahead. The Dachau concentration camp was liberated by American forces on April 29, 1945. What the soldiers found there was not just evidence of death, it was evidence of a system. Corpses lay stacked near crematoria, prisoners were skeletal, guards had fled or surrendered, records were scattered, partially destroyed, hastily burned. Within weeks, the U.S. Army made a decision that would define post-war justice in its zone of occupation. Dachau would become a courtroom. The same grounds that had held prisoners would now hold defendants. The same barbed wire would enclose judges, prosecutors, and the accused. Symbolically, it made sense. Legally, it created problems that would follow every trial held there. Dachau was chosen for practical reasons. Existing infrastructure, secure location, proximity to captured suspects, psychological impact on defendants. But it was also chosen because the U.S. Army needed speed. By late 1945, American authorities were holding thousands of suspected war criminals. Processing them individually was impossible without a centralized system. Dachau became that system. Between November 1945 and August 1948, 489 separate cases, 1,672 defendants, hundreds of death sentences. No other American-run war crimes court came close in scale, and almost none of the American public knew it existed. Unlike Nuremberg, Dachau did not focus on top leadership. Instead, it prosecuted camp guards, SS non-commissioned officers, medical personnel, capos, prisoners forced into supervisory roles, low and mid-level administrators. The legal theory was simple. Participation in the camp system itself constituted a criminal conspiracy. This made prosecution easier, but it also blurred lines between individual guilt, institutional responsibility, survival under coercion, especially in the case of capos, many of whom were former prisoners themselves. Each Dachau trial followed a similar format. Military judges, usually 5 officers, a military prosecutor, defense counsel, often American officers, limited defense preparation time, heavy reliance on written testimony. There were no juries. Rules of evidence were flexible. Confessions mattered enormously. And that would become the heart of the controversy. American investigators worked under intense expectations. They were told the crimes were undeniable. The evidence was overwhelming. Justice must be swift. Interrogations often lasted for hours. Defendants were isolated. Some were threatened with immediate execution if they refused to cooperate. Years later, allegations would surface. Physical intimidation, psychological pressure, false promises, signed confessions in languages defendants barely understood. At the time, these claims were dismissed. The assumption was simple. Why would innocent men guard death camps? But justice does not operate on assumptions. Some Dachau trials involved dozens of defendants at once. This created efficiency, but reduced individual assessment. Sentences varied widely. Death by hanging, life imprisonment, fixed-term sentences, acquittal rare. The public never saw the transcripts. Even German civilians often did not know who had been sentenced or why. Justice was happening, but in near-total silence. By 1947, rumors reached Washington. Defense attorneys reported inconsistent testimony, confessions that contradicted known facts, defendants recanting statements in court. Some American officers privately questioned the process. The Army launched an internal review. Not publicly, not immediately, quietly. In 1948, the U.S. Army appointed Judge Edward L. Van Roden and Justice Gordon Simpson to review Dachau trial procedures. What they found alarmed them. While they did not conclude that the trials were entirely unjust, they documented improper interrogation methods, coerced confessions in some cases, procedural shortcuts driven by caseload pressure. Their report was explosive, so it was classified. Following the review, several death sentences were commuted. Some convictions were overturned. Others upheld despite concerns. No public apology was issued. No press conference held. To the outside world, nothing changed. But inside the Army, confidence in the Dachau system was shaken. The Dachau trials posed a question no one wanted to answer openly. Can justice remain just when speed, symbolism, and certainty replace doubt? Many defendants were unquestionably guilty. But justice demands more than guilt, it demands fairness. And fairness is hardest to maintain when the crimes are horrific. The Dachau trials created an uncomfortable legacy. They challenged the idea that justice was clean, procedures were flawless, the moral high ground was absolute. They did not fit the post-war narrative of clarity and righteousness. So they were quietly removed from popular history. Today, Dachau is remembered as a concentration camp. Few remember it was also America's largest war crimes court, a place where justice and expediency collided. a warning about how easily process can bend under moral certainty. And the precedent set at Dachau would influence trials far beyond Germany. Unlike the men tried at Dachau, General Tomoyuki Yamashita was not accused of personally killing anyone. There were no photographs placing him at massacre sites, no signed orders directing atrocities, no witnesses who claimed he gave explicit commands. Yet in September 1945, the United States decided that Yamashita would be tried and possibly executed, not for what he did, but for what he failed to prevent. This decision would permanently alter the laws of war. By late 1944, Japanese forces in the Philippines were collapsing. American forces were advancing rapidly. Japanese supply lines were cut. Communications had broken down. Yamashita commanded the 14th Area Army, spread across difficult terrain. Units operated independently, often without direct orders. During this chaos, Japanese troops committed widespread atrocities. Massacres of civilians, executions of prisoners, rape and destruction. The crimes were real, the suffering undeniable. The question was responsibility. Yamashita surrendered in September 1945. His trial began almost immediately. The charge was revolutionary: failure to control troops, allowing war crimes to occur. This was not a charge commonly used before. The military commission was American. The judges were American officers. The rules were American military law. Yamashita's defense argued he lacked communication with many units. He did not authorize atrocities. He was engaged in a defensive retreat. The court was unmoved. The American public demanded justice. The Philippines had suffered terribly. The military wanted accountability. Speed mattered. The trial lasted weeks, not months. Evidence included reports of atrocities, witness testimony, inference of responsibility. Direct orders were not required. This was new. Yamashita appealed to the U.S. Supreme Court. The case in Re Yamashita, 1946, reached the highest court in America. The majority upheld the conviction. But the dissent was extraordinary. Justice Frank Murphy wrote, "This trial is a complete disregard of the fundamental principles of justice." He warned that the precedent endangered all military commanders, including American ones. His warning was largely ignored. Yamashita was executed by hanging in February 1946. The precedent was set. Command responsibility became law. But the implications were unsettling. If a commander could be executed for crimes he did not order, how far did responsibility extend? And who would apply that standard next? The Yamashita trial was not forgotten, but it was uncomfortable. It raised doubts about fairness, about retroactive legal standards, about victor's justice. It also raised an unspoken fear. If applied universally, American commanders could be held to the same standard. That conversation never happened publicly. Despite controversy, the Yamashita standard influenced later war crimes tribunals, modern international law, rules of engagement. But its origin, an American military commission under intense political pressure, was rarely emphasized. The law outlived the debate. The Yamashita case forced a contradiction. To deny responsibility risked impunity. To enforce it risked injustice. America chose enforcement and moved on. The trial does not fit a simple narrative. It involves legal ambiguity, ethical discomfort, a precedent that cuts both ways. So it is taught briefly, if at all. Justice after war is not only about punishing evil. It is about defining responsibility. And once defined, it cannot be undone. By 1945, the moral framework of the war was firmly established in public memory. The Axis had committed crimes. The Allies had liberated. Justice flowed in one direction. But war does not operate in clean lines. American forces, like all armies operating under extreme pressure, committed acts that violated the laws of war. Most were isolated. Some were spontaneous. A few were systematic within small units. The U.S. military understood this. What it did not want was public equivalence. Justice would be applied, but carefully, quietly, and without spectacle. Under international law, war crimes are not defined by who wins. They are defined by actions. Killing surrendered prisoners. Mistreatment of detainees. Attacks on civilians. Looting and destruction without military necessity. American commanders knew this. That is why court-martials occurred. But unlike Dachau or Yamashita, these trials were not designed to send a message to the world. They were designed to maintain discipline. One of the clearest examples occurred during the Allied invasion of Sicily. In July 1943, American troops captured Axis prisoners near the Biscari airfield. What happened next violated every rule of war. Dozens of unarmed prisoners were executed. The incident was reported up the chain of command. This mattered because the U.S. Army chose not to ignore it. 2 American soldiers were charged. One was convicted and sentenced to life imprisonment. Another was acquitted. The defense argued. Combat stress. Orders misunderstood. Retaliation for enemy actions. The prosecution argued. Prisoners were clearly surrendered. No lawful order justified execution. Discipline required accountability. The trial was real. The conviction was real. The publicity was minimal. The Biscari massacre could have become a landmark case. Instead, it faded. Why? Because the war was ongoing. Because morale mattered. Because headlines were focused elsewhere. The army handled it internally. Justice was served, but without narrative. In Europe, American forces captured hundreds of thousands of Axis soldiers. Conditions varied widely. Some camps were orderly. Others were overcrowded, undersupplied, chaotic. Investigations later found cases of beatings, denial of medical care, exposure deaths, summary shootings during combat operations. Most incidents never reached trial. Those that did were often reduced to administrative discipline. American commanders struggled with a recurring dilemma. At what point does battlefield chaos become criminal intent? Combat blurred judgment. Fear shortened tempers. Revenge was human. The Army's solution was pragmatic, not philosophical. Punish enough to maintain order. Suppress enough to maintain legitimacy. Strategic bombing created another uncomfortable reality. American bombers killed civilians by the tens of thousands. Cities like Hamburg, Dresden, Tokyo burned. Were these war crimes? Legally, no, according to the standards of the time. Morally, the question lingered. But no American air commander faced trial. The distinction between lawful destruction and criminal killing was defined by policy, not outcome. In several documented cases, investigations confirmed wrongdoing. Commanders issued reprimands. Soldiers were transferred or discharged. But no court followed. Why? Because prosecution risked setting precedents, weakening command authority, complicating post-war justice narratives. Silence was safer. In the Pacific, The war was especially brutal. Japanese resistance was fierce. Surrender was rare. Racial hatred intensified violence. American troops sometimes took no prisoners, collected body parts as trophies, shot wounded enemies. These actions violated military law. Some were punished. Most were ignored. Because the war demanded momentum, a small number of American soldiers were court-martialed for killing prisoners, looting, assaulting civilians. Sentences ranged from demotion to imprisonment. Executions were extremely rare, and none of these cases were publicized beyond military records. The U.S. government faced a strategic reality. It was prosecuting the enemy for crimes. It could not appear morally symmetrical. Publicizing Allied crimes risked propaganda exploitation, domestic backlash, legal complications. So justice became internal. This created a paradox. America could claim truthfully. It punished its own soldiers. It upheld military law. But it could also ensure. These cases did not define the war. The larger narrative remained intact. History remembers what is emphasized. And these trials were not. After the war, most records remained buried in archives. Veterans rarely spoke publicly. The press moved on. Textbooks simplified. The message was implicit. These were exceptions, not stories. America did not ignore Allied war crimes, but it did not elevate them. Justice existed, but it was controlled, contained, and contextualized. And that choice shaped historical memory as much as any verdict. By the late 1940s, the world changed again. The enemy was no longer defeated Germany or Japan. The new enemy was ideological and invisible. The Cold War began quietly but decisively. The United States now needed a stable West Germany, a rebuilt Japan, former enemies as allies. Justice, once urgent, became inconvenient. War crimes trials slowed. Sentences were reviewed again. Executions became rare. And releases began. Many individuals convicted in American-run trials did not serve full sentences. By the early 1950s, life sentences were reduced. Death sentences commuted. Prison terms shortened. Official reasons included humanitarian considerations, good behavior, political necessity. Unofficially, the message was clear. The future mattered more than the past. As Germany and Japan became strategic partners, prolonged punishment created friction. Former war criminals entered civil society, returned to professional life. In some cases, resumed positions of influence. The trials that had once been necessary became embarrassing. So they were quietly removed from public discourse. Public memory favors clarity. Good versus evil. Liberators versus criminals. Justice versus atrocity. The American war crimes trials did not fit neatly into that structure. They were complex, procedural, morally uncomfortable. So history simplified. Nuremberg became the symbol. Everything else became footnotes. Textbooks mentioned Nazi crimes, Japanese atrocities, international justice. They rarely mentioned Dachau trials, Yamashita dissent, Allied court-martials, sentence reversals. Omission does not require denial. It only requires silence. Many American veterans knew these stories. Some had guarded prisoners. Some testified in trials. Some served as judges or investigators. Most never spoke publicly. Not out of guilt, but out of exhaustion. The war had taken enough. Thousands of documents remained classified for decades. Others were technically public, but buried. Access required time, legal knowledge, determination. Popular history rarely digs that deep. And so the trials faded. Discussing these trials raised difficult questions. Can justice be impartial after total war? Can victors judge without bias? Can law survive moral certainty? Silence avoided those questions. The American war crimes trials reveal a hard truth. Justice is never separate from power. Who is tried? How quickly? Under what rules? With what publicity? All are choices. America made those choices pragmatically, not cynically but strategically. They do not show hypocrisy alone. They show a nation struggling to apply law after unprecedented violence, a military trying to balance morality with stability, a society unwilling to sit with ambiguity. This is not condemnation. It is explanation. When history forgets complexity, it becomes fragile. When justice is remembered only as triumph, it loses credibility. Understanding these trials strengthens, not weakens, the historical record. The War Crimes Trials America rarely talks about ask one final question. Is justice something we perform or something we endure? Because true justice is uncomfortable. It resists simplification. And it survives only when examined honestly. After World War II, America stood in judgment of others. It did so imperfectly, sometimes bravely, sometimes quietly. The story is not one of failure, but of human limits. And remembering these trials does not diminish victory. It completes it.